a very important topic, particularly for remote workers and for remote employers. So we've really looking forward to the conversation. Just in terms of housekeeping, I want to make you aware that we are recording this session. Rose has just hit record there now. So that's for your info. Hello, Renata, you're very welcome. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our two guests, Adrian Purcell and Alex Bacik from Palo Alto Networks, who are going to take us through a presentation they've prepared. And then, of course, we have any questions. But by all means, as we go, folks, if you think of questions, we can stick them up in the chat. I can ask them. If you want to raise your hand, you can ask them. We want this to be fairly interactive as well. But looking very forward very much to what the two men have ready. So over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, John. How's the sound there? Is it okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Good. Okay. Thanks very much. And hello, everybody. I really appreciate your time and turning up to another Zoom. It's I don't know about you, but we're completely worn out from them. We seem to be double and triple booked these days. But it's yeah, sure. It's good to be here. We're going to, as John said, it's about 15. We've about 15 slides. Our view is that we don't want to overdo the slides part of it and bore people, make it conversational as much as we can. And the presentation part of it should run up to maybe 30-35 minutes and leave some time for Q&A afterwards. I don't know, John, what your preference is. Do you do questions throughout, or do you leave them to the end, or how do you moderate these things? But
whatever you prefer, actually. Would you like to take questions as we go?
We're happy enough to do that. Yeah, there's, like as we say, we've plenty of time to allow for that if that's what people wish. So by all means, interrupt as we go. Keep us honest, ask us questions, however you want to do things. So just introductions ourselves. For my part, I'm Adrian Purcell. I'm 20 years in technology or so, and I've started out as an engineer working in the semiconductor industry and did that for the first half of my career, and further moved from that into business development and sales and cybersecurity, and now kind of working. I'm a regional sales manager for Palo Alto Networks in Ireland. We cover a broad range of the market here, but it's a wonderful business to be in. It's tremendously exciting. We are doing good things, I believe. We're looking after the people and organizations in the country and preventing successful cyber attacks and protecting our way of life in the digital age. That's our mission. And it's rewarding, it's exciting, it's busy, but we love it. And I work with Alex. I'll let Alex introduce himself there.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Alex. I work alongside Adrian here in Ireland for Palo Alto Networks. For about a year and a bit now, Adrian, we've been together. I like Adrian, started out in a different role, building and maintaining internet service providers. So the very first service providers here in Ireland. I then kind of pivoted in cybersecurity, which I've been working with ever since. And it's been, very, like Adrian says, it's a very exciting industry to be in. I've worked in US, UK, Central Europe, as well as Asia a bit as well. So I've got a kind of a fairly, fairly mixed experience in terms of cyber around the world. But I'm delighted to be part of this with Adrian.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Alex. So, Alex, do you want to flip it on there? So it's our agenda is broken into two-ish kind of sections, which is technology first. Alex, he is much smarter than me. He's the brains in the operation. He's going to go through that part of it, and we'll talk about the current threat landscape, the types of threats that we see, and how they impact on, I guess, fundamentally, we're looking at the presentation and the topic for today about remote working. It can almost be broken into two sections, which is, the home worker is one area, and there's a set of challenges there. And then remote working more generally, whether that's from a digital hub or from one of these sort of designated offices is slightly different problems, some similar issues and challenges, but slightly different in how we would address that. So we'll try and make a little bit of a distinction between those. We'll look at the cybersecurity technologies that are relevant and for remote workers, and then the best practices for organizations. Say if you're either in the business of delivering security for a particular organization, or maybe you've got a small business or something like that, and you need to protect your office. We'll move from there into people and practices. I'll cover this piece of it, with Alex. So we'll look at just general information around we'll look at the physical connections and how you might address those issues, the best practices around passwords, and then finally we'll look at when things go wrong, because we are cybersecurity professionals, and we meet organizations daily. Some of those are the most secure in the world in terms of large corporates, and some of them are small businesses and government organizations, the whole gambit. But the reality of the matter is, there's an old saying out there, there are two types of organizations: those who know they've been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. One way or another, you can only set up your defenses to best practices, but if somebody wants to get you, so there are ways to remediate, and if you are breached, how to identify that and remediate the problem as quickly as possible. So let me just move on here. Alex, if you would hit the next slide, please. So what we're saying here, I'm not going to bore you to death with statistics because everybody knows what's happened. Remote working is, of course, fast becoming the norm. We know that, and I don't think we need to prove anything there. There are gazillions of statistics out there about the speed of adoption, the levels of productivity, the benefits and the pitfalls. There's a wealth of information out there, but the reality of the matter was that remote working was on the increase significantly for 2 decades, ever before COVID came along. COVID just is the driver to push to really cement that move. A lot of issues to be figured out still on how that will be, how to best, I suppose, avail of the situation. And we, for our part, for example, in Palo Alto Networks, our headquarters is in Santa Clara in California, and we've adopted a methodology called flex work. And the idea behind it being that workers, there are benefits to having people offsite and working remotely in terms of travel time, flexibility, all the rest of these things. But there are some negatives that we see in terms of collaboration, for example. We are humans. Humans like to interact with one another. We are social creatures. And innovation and collaboration are obviously impacted if we all have to work remotely. So the idea, I think the future state, we see it at the moment, and is going to be a balance of those things. So, offices might be maintained for meeting purposes, for collaboration, for bringing customers on site and that kind of thing. But the majority of work would be done remotely. So that's going to be our approach. I think a lot of the Silicon Valley companies are kind of taking the same view. In terms of the 74% stat, that's from Gartner. We rate them. Obviously, they're saying 74% of CFOs are saying that remote work is here to stay. So that's quite compelling. How they're going to deal with their office spaces and all the rest, but that's another question. But look, that will be dealt with too. And then when you move on from we all accept that the remote work is here to stay and it's only going to grow. The top concerns then are around performance management and cybersecurity. If we, on the last slide, I had a background there of the weighing scales, balance essentially. And cybersecurity has always been and will always face that challenge. How do you keep workers productive, whether on site in an office space, and keep them secure? And what I mean by productive and secure is it is often seen that security can be an inhibitor to the productivity of a workforce. And an easy example of that is two-factor authentication, for example. Everybody's familiar with having to go through a couple of phases of logging on to their bank account, for example. But if you extrapolate that out further and you implement various logon policies and various levels of control, and you put in systems that impact on the speed that data can traverse a network cable. For example, more controls equal more hindrance on the transfer of data, reduces productivity. So the holy grail has always been, how do I maximize performance and throughput and at the same time have the best of security available? So that's the challenge for security vendors and for security practitioners. And the more successful organizations out there are the ones that are able to get that balance right. You can't have everything. You have to find the right balance. So that's Alex, please. Next slide. I just put this in here because we, even with your best will in the world, and we're all working remotely. And this slide is from 3 years before COVID, and it's Professor Robert Kelly. He was interviewing on the BBC about the situation in Korea at the time from his home. And as he was, and you want to hit play, Alex, please. But as everybody's familiar with this, but as he was being interviewed, his kids burst in. Now, is he thinking about best practices on cybersecurity? How is he managing that? It is difficult to do everything right when you're managing the situation from home and trying to work remotely. So, but I love this clip anyway. It's always worth a little watch. You have volume?
Sorry. Shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited in the last 6 months to a year.
Thanks, Alex. The bottom line here, the message we're trying to get across, like with the best will in the world, working from home, homeschooling, all the things that you have to do during working from home, it is presents new challenges. There are more
Professor
distractions.
Robert Kelly says he still won't go near his phone.
So that's it. Alex, do you want to hit on to the next slide, please?
Sure.
So that's it. That was the opening piece. Any questions at this point before we move into the technology stack? Okay, Alex, over to you.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to talk about in this section is essentially what the cyber risks are in remote working, what we call the threat landscape. So what's different to working in, say, a highly maintained office environment where there are sort of people who are managing and maintaining your security. So the difference in terms of just the first thing to say is we're all potential targets, right? So just because you don't work for a big financial technology company with a big target on your back doesn't mean that you're not a valuable target for a cyber criminal or for some of the more automated threats out there. So, the idea that you're kind of less vulnerable because you're not as big of a target is actually not the case. So we're finding a lot of the time that people do get compromised, and they're being used as either stepping stones or they may be potentially used for other things. So in the office, there's generally a trade-off. Like any Irish company, there'll be a trade-off between security and productivity, right? So the most secure network is what we call a dark network, not connected to the internet at all. But obviously that's not practical. So there's a trade-off between security and productivity. So there are security controls in there, which I'll talk about. But for the most part, there's a good balance there to keep people productive while maintaining their security. At home, generally, convenience usually wins every time. So we just want things to work. We essentially we're creatures of convenience. The second point I want to make is, that usually on a home network or a connection in a hotel or a coffee shop, the office rules don't apply. So you probably have an internet connection that came with a router and home Wi-Fi. You probably have a mix of family members with maybe shared devices, consumer devices like IoT, so Nest thermostats, Ring cameras, doorbells, voice assistants, all of these kinds of things. Some of them are absolutely fine. Some of them just clog up your bandwidth, but some of them are kind of in a gray area, right? So I've got, a couple of Wi-Fi cameras here at home, and some of them, particularly the cheaper ones, they really are on the gray area between malware and a genuine product. So you do have to be careful. The point here is you're sharing that entire connection, and each device is mutually vulnerable. The security that normally your router provides you, that you get from one of the ISPs in Ireland, provides a good level of security. It keeps the bad stuff out generally. But once something is allowed to come into your network, that then has free reign within your network. We call that lateral movement. So once one device is compromised, the other devices typically are extremely vulnerable. So we see that again and again. So just because you think your phone is secure and your laptop is, got anti-malware on it, perhaps your printer or camera is vulnerable. And there are plenty of examples of this happening. If one device gets compromised, so do potentially the other ones. The home Wi-Fi itself can be insecure. So, it's fairly trivially simple to break into someone's home Wi-Fi. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but there are devices out there that will do it relatively straightforwardly. So we would at Palo Alto Networks would always consider Wi-Fi as being insecure in particular. You've got to assume that that's an area of weakness in your home network. So what does that mean? What's the worst thing that can happen? So what, right? So your Wi-Fi doesn't have the latest version of WEP. Maybe your password's a little bit old. Maybe you've got a couple of IoT devices, cameras and so on. What's the absolute worst that can happen? Well, you may have a device that's given to you, provided to you by work, and that probably has some kind of controls on it. But at the end of the day, if the network is insecure or the network is easily compromised, there are things that can happen. So what are the actual things that can happen? Well, let me just see. I've got the top three here. So these are the top three things that can happen, and you can loosely divide this into the stuff that you can see and the stuff that you can't. And very often, as is often the case, the stuff you can't see is the problem. So the top threat out there at the moment is ransomware. Okay, so I remember about 4 or 5 years ago now, when WannaCry came out, the famous ransomware, took down the NHS in the UK and a bunch of Irish businesses. You basically got a red screen. Okay, so that red screen said, you have been compromised. All of your files are encrypted. You can't see them. You won't see them ever again unless you pay us, whatever it was, half a Bitcoin or something like that. So that's the stuff you can see. That's ransomware. Everybody knows that usually is a result of a phishing campaign. Somebody sends you an email. That email will either have a link in it, or a document with a link in it, or a document with something embedded. That's called essentially a Trojan, and that will essentially allow an attacker to compromise your machine, encrypt everything on it, and then give you a nice message saying, please contact this, usually a Gmail address, and wait for further instructions. That's the stuff you can see. Number two is really command and control via phishing. So this is very often we see this all the time. We see Irish home users being part of what are called botnets. And by botnet, we mean a centrally controlled infrastructure of compromised computers that individually mightn't have that much value to an attacker, but if you combine them, you can do an awful lot of things with them, from denial of service. So you can bring down large websites, what we call sometimes denial of service ransomware. So they'll say to a business, "We'll bring you down until you pay us some ransom." Right through to conducting spam campaigns, right through to stealing your data. So all of those kind of things are what we call command and control. Your device, although it feels the same, looks the same to you, is actually in the control of somebody else under the hood in the engine. And finally, then data theft. So this is straight data theft. Usually something like form jacking or some way of essentially stealing your username and password for your internet banking usually, or stealing your username and password for your email and then using that to what we call escalate, meaning using the fact that they have your email, they'll use that email to send spear phishing to some of your contacts. And we see this again and again. We see typically in large Irish companies, it's not the CEOs being compromised. It may be their son or daughter's laptop that's been compromised, and then they use that to escalate. So that falls into the category of data theft as well. And all of this is a regulatory impact, of course, particularly when you're talking about a data breach. So Irish companies have obligations under the data protection to disclose breaches, and we can go into that in a bit more detail. So there are impacts there as well. Any questions on the threat landscape? I don't mean to kind of paint a gloomy and dark picture there, just things to be aware of, practical things to be aware of.
So Alex, there's a question in the chat there.
Sure.
If your devices are being used for those sort of attacks, like I don't even know what that means now, a DNS attack,
yeah,
that be reflected in the data usage or impacting the bandwidth?
So typically
get noticed.
So typically that's how it is noticed. So the typical compromise, particularly at top threat number 2, command and control, that will be picked up because your phone battery is, or your laptop battery, instead of your laptop lasting 4 hours, it lasts half an hour, and you'll notice the fan keeps going. So that's typically how it happens. Or you get, data overage bills. You notice that your bandwidth is saturated. Netflix won't be buffering because your bandwidth is being used. So that would typically be an indicator of command and control for denial of service. Denial of service meaning your internet connection is being hijacked and used to overwhelm a service on the internet. We have many examples of that. The most famous, there's a bunch of them, but Mirai would be one of them, which used IoT devices, which individually weren't capable of much. But once you have 10,000 of them acting as a botnet, it's quite a large a volume of, a large weapon that you've got.
Very good. There's one other question there while we're on a roll. Would you say that smart meters are also a potential risk?
Smart meters, yeah. I mean, they generally, so most of the devices I'm talking about, so the really risky devices here, I'm talking about when you go onto Amazon and you buy a €30 video camera that includes remote access. So you have an app on your phone and you can see what that camera sees. That is the biggest threat, because that camera has a small processor on it with probably about about half a gig of memories, but enough to kind of pose a threat, okay? Because it's running usually an embedded system like BusyBox or some of those small Linux systems. You can do things with those types of operating system. Smart meter doesn't really fall into that category. It doesn't have general purpose microprocessors in it. It's more designed, if anyone is into Arduino versus Raspberry Pi, that's the kind of the distinction. So one is a computer and one is effectively like the microprocessor you have in your microwave. Smart meters would not be seen as a major threat. It's not to say that they aren't a threat, they are, but they don't have the same level of attack surface, as we call it, and they don't have the same degree of desirability for an attacker because they generally don't have the capability to, for example, for denial of service, for credential theft. So we don't see that so much as cyber attack. We do see that sometimes with nation states. So nation states are, a threat to those types of infrastructure. So what's considered critical infrastructure.
Brilliant. And one other question.
So that would be my take on smart meter.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Another question coming from Michelle, and thanks, Michelle. Is something like malware bytes enough to detect those threats?
Yeah. It is. I mean, in general, it is. I mean, obviously, we're Palo Alto Networks and we have competing products. A foundational security product that most small businesses will deploy will be what we used to call antivirus, which is now called endpoint protection, and which is increasingly called endpoint detection and remediation. Any of those is better than nothing, right? So some of them are terribly basic. They will just look at files in your computer and they will block them if they're viruses. Some of them are a lot more sophisticated, but in general, most of them will look for real threats on that are running on your computer, things like command and control, and most of those, and that's a foundational level of protection that I think any cyber professional would recommend.
Okay, thanks a million.
Okay, so moving on. So what? Let's just build out the slide. What technology can help secure remote networking, which is what we were just talking about. So essentially, again, what we would assume about most home office, don't make assumptions about your network. Generally, you're secure enough on your home network because nobody's taking the time to break into your network. I'm talking generally here about your Wi-Fi network now, because your Wi-Fi network is the weakest point in your home network. If somebody sets out to do it, just be aware that they can do it from a car outside your house. Okay, so that's just something to be aware of. So we in Palo Alto Networks would assume largely when we're providing small and medium Irish businesses with home working solutions, we would generally assume that the network is compromised. So we assume that the cyber attacker has a foothold on a network, and we work on that principle. On that basis, the device is the first and last line of defense. We have to put that foundational control on the device such that, if there are, particularly threats on that device, we can identify them. And similarly with the communication coming in and out of that device, we, again, we want to encrypt that and secure that as much as possible with a number of technical means. So I guess in all of this, technology is the problem, but it can also provide solutions. So, and what we're talking about is not sort of, the NSA sort of spending lots and lots of money. I'm talking about basic foundational, like a lot of these tools are free. So, there are some of these tools, like, for example, just give one that I use myself, which is called Knock Knock on Mac, calls out anything that's running on your Macintosh that's not part of the baseline Mac OS operating system. There are lots of Windows equivalents, and there's lots of tools. The point is here, you just need a little bit of attention from time to time to essentially make sure that you're not the most vulnerable in terms of technology. Okay, so the technology choices that you make, are typically out of convenience. There's nothing to stop somebody having an open Wi-Fi network with no password at all. That's fine. And we at Palo Alto Networks, again, assume that that's the case. We put a demarcation on the actual device itself. And again, we would recommend foundational controls like endpoint protection, antivirus, and again, encryption or VPN. If you're a small business in particular, that can be a very effective way of really limiting the damage that an attacker can do, even if they already have a foothold in a network. Okay, any questions on that before we move on?
Yeah, Alex, there's one question there in the chat.
Sure, yeah, John, go ahead.
Any good recommendations for something similar for a Windows OS, like the Knock Knock equivalent?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I would say is, operating system version, right? So Windows 7 is end of life. The first thing you can do is, if you're running any Windows 7 or Windows Server 2003, is start migrating up to Server 2016 or Windows 10. That's probably the quickest win for the least effort. In terms of actually endpoint protection, there's a bunch of, free and open source versions, they tend to be terribly basic because they don't have a lot of financial capability behind them. But there are a bunch of those. So there's ClamAV would be one of the big open source ones on Windows. That's available for Linux as well, and Mac, I think. But there are a few others. You do want to be careful though here, because there are an awful lot of, particularly on Android and Windows, there are a lot of applications that will masquerade as actually security applications that are borderline what we call grayware. So they mightn't be malware per se, and they'll claim to be protecting your machine, but they actually won't do it. So a lot of the, if you do a bit of Googling, you tend to get mixed in with the genuine software protection platforms like ClamAV. You'll find some sort of grayware as well. So just be a little bit careful. Do a bit of research. There are some really good articles online on how to protect your home computer. One of the very best ones is I've seen is Reporters Without Borders have an article on how to protect your own endpoint. Now, this is your personal laptop rather than your work provided laptop, because your work laptop will obviously have its own protections. So if you look up Reporters Without Borders, they have an article that I believe Edward Snowden was involved with writing, and it calls out some of these particular controls. It mentions Knock Knock, for example. It mentions ClamAV and other variants, and it mentions use a VPN and all the other techniques. Also physical controls like never let your laptop out of your sight and all those kind of things. It was written with journalists in mind in dodgy regimes, but it can easily be applied to home working security. Any other questions, John?
Not right now, anyway. No.
Okay,
maybe we'll get
great.
some more.
Okay, so now I'm just going to kind of call out as a kind of a final slide for me before I hand back to Adrian. So what are the available solutions? So I've talked about what you can hopefully kind of practically do at a personal level. So what would be the gold standard in terms of providing cybersecurity for home workers? Well, I've kind of simplified here a little bit, but I can go into detail if anyone wants to. So in third place, we have the foundational controls, like I said, I think earlier. So these are generally very basic controls, but will protect you up to quite a high level. If you're a small Irish business, say if you're 50 employees or 20 employees, you'd be looking at something like this to protect your home workers. So that means antivirus, what we call endpoint protection, endpoint management as well. So this is provided, say, free of charge with some of the more basic Office 365 subscriptions. It's also part of Windows Server as well. So any of these, you can provide these kind of policies around endpoint. So these are really basic things like don't allow an endpoint to plug into any USB, for example. You can control that with what's called GPO. Okay, so this is available to anyone who uses the Windows server platform, and it's something that you can look at and practically implement. So that would be seen as a kind of a foundational. Whoops, sorry. Then the next level up, the next level would be, again, providing a bit more control. So VPN, virtual private network, or securing communications in and out of an insecure home network. That would be seen as the next level up. Again, you probably need some kind of either hardware to do this or some kind of cloud subscription to do this. But essentially what it means is that any of the communications that go in and out of a home network can't be intercepted. So we guarantee the confidentiality and integrity of that communication. And then also some kind of authentication piece as well. And this can be really basic. It can link in with Active Directory if you're a Windows server, or it can be more sophisticated, like what we call multi-factor or two-factor authentication, where you get a ping on your phone just to validate that it's you. Also included in there is traffic visibility. So we're not talking here about, sophisticated blocking of malware or identification of hackers. We're just talking about visibility. So that if something happens, if you do have a data breach and the data commissioner comes knocking on your door, and you have to present to them what's happened, you can say, look, under GDPR, I had the technical controls in place. Here's my traffic logs. That provides a best effort in terms of, forensic capability. I can call out what happened. I can call out the scope of the breach, that type of thing. That would be seen as level 2. And then finally, at the first level, the top level, what we generally find is, you find this with larger companies, companies with mature, large cyber budgets. So where you have both remote users on their mobile and laptop secured, and also branch secured, but all on the same platform. So typically there you'll have things like all the controls that I've mentioned, plus additional controls, things like data loss prevention, things like behavioral analysis, quite sophisticated controls. These things can take time to implement, but I'm just calling it out as a kind of a gold standard of what would be used in the corporate world to secure network and remote workers. Okay, if there's no questions, then I'll move on to the next section. If anyone wants me to dive into any of these in a bit more detail, I'll be happy to do so.
Sorry, Adrian. Is there any VPN recommendations or ones that we should stay clear of?
Yeah, so there's a couple. I mean, so they divide into two. They divide into three. So the first recommendation I would make at a kind of a personal level that I use personally is OpenVPN. It's free and open source. You can have it up and running in about 10 minutes. Essentially what it will do is it runs on your laptop, your desktop, your phone. And what it will do is it will connect to something. Now, what is that something? Well, you'll have to set it up. It could be a server in the cloud. You can run a server in the cloud for about $5 or a month. OpenVPN is free. So that's the first option. So what that will do is that will give you protection against tampering and eavesdropping on your network. The second level then is some kind of hardware device. Most of the hardware devices that you buy come from vendors like ourselves. Other vendors are available. There's also open source vendors like Untangle, pfSense. Those are free and open source. You need to provide the hardware, but any kind of computer will do. The problem with those is you have to manage, maintain them, quite a bit of watering and feeding. But again, provides the same thing in principle. Your remote workers can VPN back in to those devices. And then the third, and arguably probably the most popular, would be these cloud VPN vendors, of which Palo Alto Networks is one. And these provide a kind of out-of-the-box, best-of-breed secured VPN for both your home workers, that's people on laptops and phones, and also your branch offices. So you plug it in all together, and effectively you have an out-of-the-box solution. Okay, so I know that's kind of broad, and it covers from free to paid, so there's quite a bit in between there. So if anyone wants to discuss those in more detail, I'll be happy to talk to them. Okay. So in terms of then, so now we're, I was talking really about, what can you do then as an organization? Okay, so if you're a small business, and I take the example of, say, a 20 to 50 employee Irish business, what could you do practically? Like I mentioned, what are the quick wins in terms of securing home workers, things like endpoint protection and so on. But from an organizational point of view, what can you do? So, I mean, I guess the first thing you can do is anybody will tell you is a risk assessment. So what's the impact and what's the threat? So it might be a small threat, but a big impact, might be a big impact, but a small threat. You do risk assessment, and the first thing that any security officer or a security officer will do when they go into a company is they'll do a risk assessment, and they'll draw up a chart of what their jobs are going to be from 1 to 10. And typically the first jobs in that list are things like, securing endpoints, encrypting laptops, so if they get lost, they don't, you haven't lost all the data and so on. So that's the first thing that you can do is a risk assessment. There's lots of resources out there in Ireland to help small businesses do that. That would be the first thing I would call out. And I'm not talking about really fancy things like adding two-factor authentication, stuff like that. I'm talking about basic foundational controls. The second thing you could probably do is look to a remote access solution. And typically, you know, I mentioned the three types: free, the hardware, and the cloud. Most people will start off in Ireland with a hardware solution. They'll buy a firewall or a VPN concentrator. Most of the vendors have this type of solution. You may already have that somewhere in your data center if you're a medium-sized business in Ireland. You can use that functionality. Most of the time it's included, some of the time it's an additional license. But again, what it gives you is that capability of communicating securely within your organization and with home workers within your organization without their communications being tampered with or eavesdropped. That's a key point. And again, you know, ensuring the foundational security controls, things like endpoint protection, things like, you know, full disk encryption, which is part of Windows 10 and Mac OS, but, you know, ensuring that's across the organization. You know, those are the foundational security controls that we at Palo Alto Networks would start looking at before we start kind of, you know, going in for the really fancy stuff. Mm-hmm. And then cyber insurance is becoming, you know, is becoming now a practical thing. So if you go to some of the big Irish insurance vendors, they'll probably ask you to go back and implement foundational security controls first before they'll quote you. But once you can show you have things like endpoint protection, you know, you full disk encryption, maybe you have some kind of authentication scheme in place, they'll be happy to offer you a cyber insurance policy, and that will cover you in the event of a data breach. It will cover you in terms of the initial, what we call remediation of that breach, so discovery and remediation. It will also cover your exposure under things like GDPR as well. So depending on the policy, that's something that I know larger Irish businesses are looking to adopt, and I can only see that over time, you know, being adopted by medium size and smaller as time goes on. Okay, any questions on that before we move on to the next section? Okay, again, so now we're going to jump into people and processes. I think, Adrian, were you going to talk to this?
And look, the reality of the matter is technology is one aspect of securing an organization or your remote working. And we talk about in cybersecurity about reducing the attack surface. It's a key principle for securing people and organizations. And what that means is that every single device that a person has or an organization has a link to the internet or to the cloud or to a network. And every single one of those access points creates a new attack vector, a new attack point for the hackers. And so what do you do to reduce the attack surface? And you know, technology, Alex has talked about the technology aspect of it there, and you can scan and you can detect malicious activity over the wire with the right technologies. But from a people and processes point of view, a lot can be done. And some of it is quite basic, but you know, it's really worthwhile. Like Alex mentioned there, in terms of cyber insurance or in terms of GDPR, in terms of, you know, regulations, it's vital that organizations can display that they have trained staff in the best practices to reduce the threat to the organization. So what would we say? There are various sources of information. A lot of this is easily available on the web. I personally would recommend that you follow the National Cybersecurity Centre. Most countries will have one. We have one in Ireland. Unfortunately, it's a bit under-resourced at the minute, but they are hiring, they are building out capability. They're commonly referred to as the NCSC. The UK has quite a well-developed organisation. It's a bit more mature, and it has great recommendation, great policies. If you want to follow them on LinkedIn, you'll often get the updates and around what they recommend as best practice. And some of it, it's really easy to digest and easy information to practice. So what would we say here in terms of device settings? all organizations will, or they should, have various configurations applied to their devices that they hand out to their personnel, to their staff. It was funny, actually, when COVID hit, we saw lots of our customers buying thousands, literally at a time, thousands of laptops and handing them out to customers or handing them out to their staff. And there we go again, the balance between security and productivity. They had to give laptops for remote working when their offices were shut down. That was the productivity piece. But to get them out quickly, they sent them out without security applied, without secure agents and AV and all the things that Alex talked about. So in that sense, productivity won out over security, and security was an afterthought and had to be figured out afterwards. But in general, your home working laptop or device of whatever kind it is should have and will have security configurations in there that you may not necessarily think are important, but the point matter being, avoid changing those configurations. If you think you've done so by accident, contact the IT department just to inform them and be sure. Like, don't take chances. Configurations are in there for a reason. We talk about the devices. Bottom line, it's a monetary game and this is where cybersecurity branches over from. It's not just the technical aspect of it, not just the cyber aspect, but there's a genuine security aspect here. It's a valuable device, whether it's a phone or a laptop. Be careful with it. Lock it away. Make sure it's locked when you're not using it. Ensure that the right password protections are in place. But for the most part, don't leave it in your car sitting on the front passenger seat. These things become the realm of physical security quickly becomes a cyber issue once you've got a laptop that has very sensitive and PII, what we call personal information, on that laptop. You've seen it in the news before. When these things are stolen, it becomes a major issue for organizations. And so that's why encryption and things like that are very important. Again, back to don't tamper with the configurations. And then, basic stuff. If your laptop is stolen, contact your IT help desk immediately, and don't be worried about the impact or the how it's perceived that you might have lost a laptop. It's far better for your organization, and from our experience and what we see, you'll generally be rewarded, or certainly be it'll be appreciated that you've let that be known, so that IT departments can often, most people know this, can remotely go and lock that down or ensure that there's it gets wiped remotely and these kind of things. So make sure that it's reported as soon as possible. And then simple things, what's going to happen, interesting stats at the minute I've been reading, John, and the guys will know more about these things than I do, but there's, reading reports during the week of 400 remote hubs being set up around the country for remote working in the future, and a government initiative and all the investment that goes into these things. And these are shared working environments, whether, hopefully it all transpires, but, there are digital hubs out there. We do work in cafes and hopefully someday when these things open back up again, but in shared environments. One of the easiest ways for people to get your information is just looking over your shoulder. It's one of the most basic things that people can do. So privacy screens, they are very cheap and easy to install. Probably your organization will pay for them if you want to expense them. So we would recommend that as a practice. Next, please, Alex. Physical connections. So this is only use your device that the organization has given you. It sounds basic, but it can be tempting to use non-sanctioned devices without the appropriate levels of security and software applied to them for productivity's sake. Again, the balance between productivity and security, we would encourage people not to do so. There are reasons. For a start, your personal machine may already be compromised. Oftentimes they are. And once you start doing sensitive work there, the bad guys have access to whatever information you're sending over the wire. Like Alex mentioned earlier as well, you have to assume There is a principle in cybersecurity called zero trust. It is actually, it was one of our previous chief technology officers was heavily involved in its incarnation, but it's the principle that you can't trust anything or anyone on the network, and the principle of least access. And again, you open up, you start doing sensitive work on a personal machine that's already been compromised, and your organization is compromised. And then just an interesting little anecdote around, using trusted power adapters and cables. Alex, we were talking about this story yesterday about, was it the airport in Jakarta?
Yeah, so there was somebody had installed a terminal for charging your phone or laptop. Essentially, it was bristling with power sockets. Anyone could just come and plug their phone in. Everyone at an airport, their phone is dying, so people would just plug their phone in. But of course, what they didn't realize is that was embedding malware in their phones and laptops. So again, just have to be very careful. There's a cable going around at the moment for iPhone and Android called the OMG cable. It's essentially it looks like a standard USB-C or Lightning power cable, but it actually has an embedded processor within it. And if you plug that into your phone, your phone can be read essentially. So you just need to be careful. There's incredibly sophisticated attacks out there. If you've ever read some of the Snowden revelations about how these things can be done, it's quite incredible.
And there are thanks, Alex. And just I'm going to move on because we only 5 minutes left. Yeah, okay. There is and then don't connect anything physically to your computer that you don't trust implicitly. So, or connect your computer to another computer. There are cases, and actually security teams have done this in the past as well, of leaving, those old flash drives out in car parks with, that look innocuous, that people would pick up and go and plug into their computer. And all of a sudden you've downloaded malware onto your machine. So look, just be careful of what you plug in and what you connect to. In terms of passwords, Alex, please, simple stuff. Never, ever disclose your password to anybody. That includes your IT department. It includes anybody over the phone. Never, ever, anybody disclose your password. And that's, and never share it. It is, of course, acceptable to write down your password, but make sure it's locked away, make sure it's safe. Ensure that you carry out best practices with it. And your organization, should set rules around the type of password you can use, the characters that are involved with it. Again, you shouldn't share your passwords between your corporate device and what you've already used on an online application, whether that's your Fitbits or whatever that might be. So separate out your corporate passwords from your personal passwords, and try not to reuse as much as possible. The last slide I have is around when things go wrong, and they will go wrong at times. So don't feel like you've done something wrong and that you'll be punished if something goes wrong, because it happens. It happens to the best organizations in the world and the most secure. You may have heard of the likes of SolarWinds, the attack over the Christmas period there, where it's claimed, we believe, that possibly Russian hackers and maybe even government state forces were able to breach the most secure of organizations in the US and around the world, and maybe 18,000 organizations breached that had best of breed security in there by coming up with really creative ways to infiltrate the software updates. So everybody trusts the software update, but what if that software update has been compromised? You can't protect yourself all the time. So something will go wrong, may go wrong. If it does, just report it and do it as quickly as you can. An interesting one here, and Rose, fair play to you, brought it up earlier on, is the fact that one of the key indicators of something gone wrong is battery usage. And you'll see the device starting to use battery more quickly. One of the other things you could see, if something does go wrong, do not, under any circumstances, bring your corporate machines to a local repair shop. It's not secure. You should only ever bring your corporate machines back to your corporate IT. They know how to handle it. They have secure ways of, there's things that are specific to that organization. And you can't, it's the most trusted way to get things fixed. And then device tampering, again, if you suspect anything on your machine, whether that's buttons lifted, the battery pack loose, whatever it was, it could be an indicator that's somebody's been tampering with it, has installed something that shouldn't be there. Again, talk to your IT department.
Adrian and Alex, just before we wrap up, there's one question that came into me privately. Do you know of any reliable companies in Ireland that can check apartments or spaces for spy devices like hidden cameras?
Yeah. Sorry, Adrian.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So physical security. So that wouldn't really fall into our remit in terms of cyber, but there are plenty of companies that can put you on the right track. Adrian, I don't know. Do you want?
I wouldn't. Yeah, outside of our remit, I'm afraid.
Okay, no worries. Thanks. An interesting question.
It is, for sure. And if you get an answer, let me know.
Okay, I'll let you back. You're
The
getting
telecoms unit in Garda in Phoenix Park, and it would be a good starting point for that, I would say.
Very good. We're almost up on time there, gentlemen.
Yeah, that's it. I'm done. Alex has a bit of a summary there.
Yeah, I won't. I think I won't call it out again, Adrian. If there's any more questions, be happy to take them. Otherwise, we're up against the hour.
Yeah, we are. It was the hour absolutely flew by. So thank you both very much, and it was great to have the interaction from the people listening. Does anybody have any final questions before we wrap it up? So I think we're just looking at some comments coming in on the chat, but they're comments rather than questions. Generally just saying that it's been really interesting and thanks a million. I'm sure you can see the chat there yourselves. So yeah, we're going to wrap it up exactly on the hour, which is perfect timing. Thank you both, Alex and Adrian. Thanks a million. As you know, the session was recorded and we'll be making it available for everybody who couldn't make it today. Very informative, really powerful and important information for our community. So thanks a million, and thanks a million to everybody who joined the call and listened in for the last hour. We appreciate your time too, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening.